This is the story of SwissAir Flight 330. On the 21st of February 1970, a Convair 990 was on the ground at Zurich International Airport. The Convair 990 is one of those planes that wouldn't be made today. The plane is the antithesis of every modern airliner. Planes today optimize for fuel burn more than anything. But here we have a plane that drank fuel like crazy just to go a bit faster. This obsession with speed got it into the world records for the world's fastest subsonic passenger jet. That's probably a record that will probably stand for a couple more decades, if not forever. The flight today was to Kai Tak, Hong Kong, with a stopover in Tel Aviv, Israel. The plane took off from Zurich at 11:23 a.m. with 38 passengers and 9 crew members on board. Like I've said before, I will never get used to the small number of passengers on very long international flights back in the day. How did these airlines make money? But that's not the point. As the plane started to climb, all was well, until they hit about 14,000 feet. The pilots were reporting a problem with the cabin pressurization. 330, we have some trouble with the cabin compression. We have to return to Zurich. For this video, I will be adding the audio of the air traffic transmissions that we do have, and I'll also be narrating them because it's kind of hard to figure out what they're saying at some points, and I know a lot of you listen to these videos instead of watch them. So, just a little bit of a heads up.
30, we have trouble with the cabin compression. We have to return to Zurich.
Roger, what is your actual level?
140, request reverse course.
Roger, then make a right turn, SwissAir 330.
So whatever was wrong with the airplane was bad. The pilots were already asking for a routing back to the airport, which should be doable considering that they were just over Bremen at this point. The pilots were given a heading of 335 degrees and an ILS approach to runway 1. Then air traffic control gets a clearer picture from flight 330. Zurich, from SwissAir 330, we suspect an explosion in the aft compartment of the aircraft. Everything is okay at the moment, but we request descent clearance immediately and firefighting equipment on the ground for landing.
Zurich, from SwissAir 330, we suspect an explosion in the aft compartment of the aircraft. Everything is okay at the moment, but we request descent clearance immediately and firefighting equipment on the ground for landing.
The pilot in command was calm and working the problem. But air traffic control was not able to get all the information that they needed, so they asked the pilots to repeat themselves. In the tower, they could see that flight 330 was bleeding airspeed, and the plane was turning more than needed. They were now on a heading of 060. The controllers were trying to get them back on a heading of 330. The plane was going northeast, and they wanted the plane to go about northwestish. Then came a transmission from the plane that I don't think any controller is really ready to handle. We also request the police to investigate the incident.
SwissAir 330, say again, please.
We also request the police to investigate the incident.
It looked like their plane was starting to get away from them, and they knew it. The fire, it looks like, was getting worse, and the first officer said, "We have a fire on board and requesting an immediate landing." They also confirmed that they were trying to get the plane down to 6,000 feet. As the plane descended through 8,000 feet, the controllers were trying to hand the plane off to approach control. They said, maintain course 330, further instructions from approach control at 118.0. But this was not acknowledged or followed by flight 330. The controllers kept trying to raise flight 330 on the radio. After a couple of tries, the pilots replied with, switching to 118.0 for approach control. The pilots and the controllers then talked at the same time, creating a heterodyne. But a transmission from the pilot saying, "We have an electrical problem," was caught on tape.
Zurich, SwissAir 330, we have fire on board. Request an immediate landing. This is an emergency, Zurich, from 330.
338, we have electrical power. CG 330, go ahead. SwissAir 330, SwissAir 330. I cannot read you anymore. Please continue adding 330.
Things on board flight 330 was going from bad to worse. The voices of the pilots had now become strained as well. They were speaking through their oxygen masks at this point. The controller at this point had cleared the airspace and now had any runway open for Flight 330. Eventually, the pilots got on the approach frequency. Loud and clear, we are at 6,000 feet and we are, I presume, on the course 329. The plane wasn't. They were tracking due west at this point. The controllers tried to get them on the right heading, but it wasn't working. Maybe their cockpit was filling with smoke. Maybe their heading instrumentation was so out that the controllers had to improvise. According to the radar, deviate from the course, turn right until I say stop, said the controllers. No reply. They tried again. Turn to the right until I say stop. You are completely off course. The first officer agreed. ATC let them know that they were now over the town of Baden. The pilots then got back to them and said, we are now turning to 330. But now they needed an even more aggressive turn to the right to get them to the required heading. They needed to fly due north, but that was becoming harder and harder for the flight crew. The controllers were asking the pilots what kind of an approach they needed to get the plane back on the ground, but there was no reply. When they did hear back from the pilots, the transmission from the plane was bleak, declaring an emergency. We have fire and smoke on board. I can't see anything.
Emergency! We have fire, smoke, or back! I can't see anything!
The plane banked to the right. The controllers kept saying, to the right, but the pilots were losing control. The first officer says, 330 is crashing. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.
330 is crashing. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.
Flight 330 then crashes into the Swiss countryside. None of the 47 people on board make it, but air traffic control still tries to hail Flight 330. SwissAir 330 heading 080, please. SwissAir 330, please open your window, please. SwissAir 330, open your window, please. 330, I cannot read you anymore.
SwissAir 330, heading 080, please. SwissAir 330, please open the window. SwissAir 330, open your window, please. 330, I cannot read you anymore.
The controllers were waiting for a reply that would never come. Finding out what happened to Flight 330 would be a hard task considering the fact that the flight data recorder was lost in the crash. They were able to get about 10 meters of tape from the recorder, but it was not of much use. The recordings that you just heard came from the air traffic controller recordings. But the crash site held a lot of secrets. You see, aluminum alloys weaken when heated, and when cooled, the stiffness returns to the original value, but the braking strength of the material does not. The crash site showed that the cargo hold of the aircraft had been frayed, like it was pulled apart when the fuselage was under stress. You wouldn't see damage like that from a ground fire. To be sure, the investigators ran some tests. They found that the fractures seen in the metal was reproducible if mechanical load was applied exactly at the melting point of this particular aluminum alloy. Moreover, they were able to measure the hardness across the wreckage, and they found that the heat was localized in the cargo hold. They found that parts of the plane had been exposed to metal melting temperatures anywhere from 11 to 13 minutes. These pilots had a lot to handle. This is conclusive proof that the plane was on fire when it was in the air. But the design of the 990 worked against everyone on board. The cargo hold, where the fire presumably started, and the passenger cabin were connected by the small slit that allowed air to pass through. This was so that pressure could equalize when needed. This allowed smoke to billow into the cabin from whatever was burning in the hold below. The wreck had more to tell the investigators. They found wires that had been burnt in a very specific way. They were burnt along the length of the fuselage. Wires feeding into the 4 AC bus bars were burnt and they had short-circuited. The fire was slowly killing the electricals of the plane. This is probably why the pilots were reporting such bad electrical issues on Flight 330. The smoke might have been so bad that the pilots might have had to open the cockpit window to clear out the smoke. What the wreck showed was that Flight 330 was on fire long before it crashed and burned. The million-dollar question was, what set that fire? The fire damage that the plane had sustained allowed the investigators to narrow the source of the fire to the top front right corner of the rear cargo hold, right where the mail was stored. The mailbags then came under intense scrutiny after the crash. They were finding things that you usually wouldn't find in commercial mail, things like a damaged disc with the word altimeter on it. The plane had 17 sacks of mail, 2 Swedish, 5 German, and 10 Swiss. All the bags were damaged, but 4 Swiss and 1 German and 1 Swedish bag showed telltale signs of an explosion. They had signs that they were damaged by explosive fragments. The fibers along the tears made by the fragments had cooled and fused together, like a hot knife through butter. Something had exploded within these sacks, sending searing hot fragments into the cargo hold, starting a deadly fire. They needed to know what was in these mail bags. Going through the cargo manifest, they found nothing that could self-ignite or even things that were combustible. There weren't even things that could release heat. Since the circumstances of Flight 330's crash were so weird, the police had gotten involved. They saw that an item was addressed to someone named Hamid who was living in Tel Aviv, Israel. The only problem? Hamid didn't exist. 2 Jordanians had mailed a small bomb camouflaged as a TV or a record player from Germany, and that eventually found its way onto Flight 330. Another airplane, an Austrian Airlines Südaviation Caravel, had been attacked in a very similar way on the very same day. In that case, the explosive was stuffed into a small radio, and the explosions were very, very similar. Due to where the explosive was stored on the Caravel, it was able to make it back in one piece. But when they looked at the debris in the Caravel, they found that the explosive had an altimeter stuck to it. That was the detonator. Now, up to this point, I've been using the final report as a source. But due to the nature of the crash, the final report didn't talk much about who carried out the attacks. Well, someone used a FOIA request to the United States government to get some documents from the FBI. That document gives us a lot of insight into who the perpetrators were. So back in the 1970s, the Middle East was embroiled in conflict. Wait, it still is, but this was a different conflict. But in the context of 1970, they were able to uncover people who were living in Frankfurt who helped the bombers. The bombers were closely affiliated with Al-Fatah and the General Union of Palestinian Students. Apparently, at the time, the General Union of Palestinian Students was, quote, one of the key Arab groups to serve as a base of underground work for the Palestinian Liberation Movement in Germany. I will link the document from the FBI in the description if you want to take a closer look at the details. But now I'd like to pull focus from that to the crew of Flight 330. Captain Karl Berlinger, First Officer Armand Etienne, Second Officer Werner Gimme, Purser Hans Mogg, Purser Peter Frey, Hostess Claire Aubert, Hostess Elaine Gaillard, Hostess Elaine Henry, Hostess Doris Ruska. What the crew of this flight did was incredible, especially the pilots. They knew that they had a badly crippled plane, but they never gave up. They fought through the acrid smoke that blinded them and coaxed a plane that was failing around them, and they did it with professionalism. These fine folks didn't stop fighting till the very last second. Usually I don't focus on the crew of an incident. The focus is on what happened and how it happened. But sometimes you have to remember the people for their incredible actions. And I think this definitely qualifies. Godspeed, guys. Thank you for watching till the end of this video. If you want another video of pilot heroics, how about the story of the hero that America forgot? He prevented a mid-air collision with just seconds to spare. You can find that video on your screen right now. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.